Welcome to Voices of History, part of the Oral History Project of the Ismaili Special Collections Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. In this episode, we meet with Dr Mohamed Keshavjee, a former governor of the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, who is also a South African of Indian origin and a Canadian. He is an award-winning specialist in cross-cultural mediation. He studied at Queen's University in Canada and obtained his LLM and PhD degrees at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, following which he was called to the bar at Gray's Inn in London. He has lived in France for 30 years, working with the Aga Khan Development Network, where he served as International Coordinator of the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board, and later as the Director of International Training Programs at the Secretariat of His Highness Prince Karim Al Husseini Aga Khan IV. A specialist in alternative dispute resolution, he was responsible for training mediators for the Conciliation and Arbitration Board, where he conducted training programs in some 25 countries within Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. In 2016, for his work on mediation, peace, and human rights education, Dr. Keshavjee was awarded the Gandhi King Ikeda Award for Peace in Atlanta, Georgia. The ceremony took place at the annual Peace Fair and Interfaith Assembly hosted by the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College. Dr. Keshavjee is a published author who has written books on Islam, Sharia, alternative dispute resolution, and the migration of the Indian diaspora to South Africa. Along with numerous articles and chapters on these themes, he is also the author of a collection of short stories. Born in South Africa, to a family deeply engaged in education, community service, and leadership, Dr. Keshavjee's life journey has taken him across continents from Africa to England, then Canada to France, where he worked extensively in development, law, mediation, migration, and human rights. In this episode, Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee reflects on his journey from apartheid-era South Africa to global leadership under His late Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan IV, the 49th Ismaili Imam. He shares personal memories of his father and mother, insights on law and mediation, and the transformative legacy of His late Highness Aga Khan IV. Reflecting on the transformative period of the 1960s, Dr. Keshavjee offers a vivid account of growing up in apartheid South Africa, where his family home in Pretoria was a hub of intellectual discourse and activism. As a young boy, in the midst of global decolonization, he witnessed firsthand the political and social upheavals that shaped South Africa's freedom movement. Dr. Keshavjee reflects on a time of struggle, hope, and transformation, when the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960 shook the nation. Decolonization, which Harold Macmillan has termed as winds of change, swept across Africa, and his own family made the difficult decision to leave after decades in the country.
It sort of takes me back to many years, but it was a very interesting time. I was a young boy, came from a large family. I had 12 siblings, but our house was a hive of intellectual activity in a way. My two brothers had been to university. I think 1960, my eldest brother was in university. He was doing psychology, sociology, literature, and economics. And 3 years earlier, I had another brother who was an undergraduate. And then also at our house, we had a cousin frequenting very often, and she was the first female medical doctor in the Ismaili community. So it was a time of great excitement because apartheid was a very difficult situation, But I think it produced a lot of people, artists, doctors, lawyers, economists, political scientists, social activists, political activists who were involved in the process of fighting for freedom. And so I remember our home as a place where a lot of discussions took place. My different siblings, friends used to walk in and out. The Pretoria intelligentsia, many people who had been to university, Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, used to find a ready welcome at our home. So our home had people who were black, brown, white, people walked in, and there was always a discourse.
Right.
But I think 1960 was an important time because that's the time when the Sharpeville massacre took place, where the apartheid police opened fire on 69 people in the most inhuman way. And I think that changed the destiny of South Africa because the political movements now were not able to operate within the country, but had to leave for other parts of the world from which the freedom movement gained acceleration. So people like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, the man who drafted the South African Constitution.
Right.
All these people were very much involved in the political process. So it was a time of excitement in a way. For a young boy, it was interesting to look at all these developments taking place. We in the Pretoria setting, we had a home that was right at the hub of activities. We used to see some of these people come in and out daily. And also the global situation was interesting because the wind of change was blowing over Africa.
Yes.
We were just about 3 years away from a major decolonization process that took place in succession. 1961, I think, was Tanzania or Tanganyika. 1962, Uganda got its independence. 1963, Kenya got its independence. And I think also 63 was when Zanzibar became independent. So a large chunk of Africa was going through the decolonization process. West Africa had already seen that process. I think Nigeria had just become independent. Ghana gained its independence in 1957. And it was a time of major Cold War politics, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and then also different movements taking place in Europe. We were all part of that process as we were growing up. So they were exciting times. But from a 15-year-old boy's perspective, I would say it was interesting in the sense that we didn't know what the future was going to be, but we were aware of the changes that were on the horizon. And also it was a time when our family decided now to leave South Africa.
Right.
After almost, literally 60 years after my grandfather came, we now decided to leave the country.
Right.
Now, my brother has written about this period also as a funeral memoir of my father.
Okay.
My elder brother wrote this, so he's 6 years older than me. So it's very interesting that though he wrote this much later, when my father died in 1986, I think, he captured that period of our life and his memories of my father and the struggle against apartheid and the life of the Jamaat at the time.
Right.
So it was an exciting period for all of us,
Right.
which we remember with great fondness, but also as a time of not sadness, but as a time of hope, as a time of aspiration,
Right.
but also as a time of great difficulty. It was a fight for human rights,
Absolutely.
We were always struggling for daily existence, as it were.
Family conflicts can divide, but they can also reveal deeper lessons in resilience, generosity, and perspective. Here, Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee reflects on how his father, Nazir Ali Manji Keshavjee, navigated personal and professional challenges, not with resentment, but with a commitment to something greater than himself. Despite tensions within the family, his father remained focused on what truly mattered: the power of education, the strength of community, and the importance of rising above personal grievances. His ability to set aside conflict for the greater good left a lasting impression on Dr. Keshavjee, shaping his approach to law, mediation, conciliation, and the pursuit of justice. Through this lens, Dr. Keshavjee explores how conflict isn't just about opposing sides. It's an opportunity to foster understanding, build bridges, and seek solutions that go beyond the immediate dispute.
Yes, I think my father was interesting in the way he operated. He was in conflict with his brothers in business. They had a very large business enterprise, but unfortunately there were three brothers who were not able to work together. But what was very interesting is that my father was responsible with his brothers for educating the first female doctor in the Ismaili community, a doctor called Dr. Keshavjee. Yes. She was the first Ismaili woman to go to university in South Africa, and she became a doctor. She qualified in 1956. And what I think was amazing when I look back is that though my father was in conflict in business with his brothers, he continued to contribute towards the education of this niece of his and saw her through medical school as being 1/3 contributory to her educational program.
Right.
That means he didn't let the conflict destroy this girl's educational future. So I thought that was, to me, a very deeply influencing moment as I became a lawyer and I got into dispute resolution. But even more important than that, in 1956, when my cousin became a doctor, when this lady became a doctor, my father actually put a plaque on our veranda.
Wow.
For her medical practice because she didn't have a surgery.
Right.
So the first patient she saw was in our home.
Wow.
And I was very sort of touched by that he was not filled with anger.
Yes.
He was not filled with any sort of hate. And so the first Ismaili doctor in South Africa, the first woman to go to university, was largely, interestingly, during the context of a family conflict.
Yes.
Which to me was very interesting in the time that when I conceptualized the program on dispute resolution, to say that families do have difficulties, people do have conflicts. And I don't mean to sound judgmental because my cousins and I grew up together. Our uncles and us did not have anger, as it were, though my father was in a conflictual situation.
Right.
So I thought that was an influence of my father that was very strong when I did the program, to say that can we build into the program certain elements of sort of forgiveness, certain elements of collaboration, certain elements of looking at a bigger picture in a conflict rather than the individual picture of positional bargaining.
Yes.
Rather look at the bigger principles. And I think that for that I would strongly commend the work my father did. I mean, one can say it's your father, so you'd feel that way. But I just think that he was able to subordinate his own anger and his pain, because he did go through pain. He was a very hardworking man. He was a very creative individual. But this apartheid system was not conducive to people being able to survive when things broke down.
Right.
And I think that was something that I always recall of my father's contribution.
Absolutely.
As a hardworking man, but one who was able to look at some things beyond his own personal interest.
While history often amplifies the voices of men, women have been the quiet architects of community evolution. This is especially true in the Ismaili community, where women played a pivotal role in education, healthcare, and institutional development, often behind the scenes. Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee's mother, Kulsum Manji Keshavjee was no exception. Coming from a distinguished lineage of religious education teachers, she and her sister became the first women appointed in 1946 to the Pretoria Provincial Council by His Highness Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III, the 48th Ismaili Imam. A fluent English speaker and a strong advocate for education, she ensured that her children were deeply rooted in both secular and religious learning. Dr. Keshavjee reflects on his mother's influence, how she, alongside other pioneering women, shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of their community.
Well, my mother, like many other women in South Africa, played a critical role in the community's evolution from the early 1900s. So while men tended to be much more dominant because of the colonial structure. Yes. Remember, man came as the people in the indentured system. Yes. I mean, we're all part of what you call the Girmitya system of people coming out of India to different British colonies. So while man had to play the primary role of bringing bread onto the table, particularly in the Ismaili community, in my book, Into That Heaven of Freedom, chronicles this beautifully, that the women were the institutional backbone. You know, the whole Beit al-Ilm structure, the whole clinic that was started in Pretoria, the whole organizational ethos was largely pioneered by women.
Yes.
I had my father's sister, Sakina Manji Keshavjee, or Sakina K.K. Koja, played a very prominent role in the Indian Women's Association as early as 1928. My mother and her sister had gone to a Christian school. They went to I think it was a group from New Zealand who started or were teachers in the Ferguson school.
Right.
And so they went to a church school and they spoke English very fluently. I think in 1946, Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah at that time appointed my mother and her sister as the first two lady members of the Pretoria Provincial Council. Wow. It was the first time that ever happened in South Africa. So my mother had that great influence on our life as children, because backing my father, she ensured that we went to religious school every day. I mean, every day. It wasn't once a week. It was every day. We had to go to the school in the afternoon.
Wow.
And we had to go to the secular school in the morning. And then they ensured that we went to Jamaat Khana regularly, that we did our homework, that we read. I mean, our home had a small library. My father collected books for us. Many of the books that my father collected as early as the 1930s are part of the collection that I gifted to South Africa, to the Ismaili Knowledge Center in South Africa.
Right. I
dedicated or gifted about 3,000 to 5,000 books. So our house had that ambiance of, I had a cousin who was running quizzes once every fortnight.
Right.
We had a teacher from Pakistan, Master Sadruddin Kimani, who in those days used to refer to books of Marshall Hodgson and Bernard Lewis and, people like, Albert Hourani. So these type of books were something as children that we were exposed to. So my mother played an important role. But I don't think she was alone. She was part of a larger group of women. And her mother was a teacher of religious education.
Yes.
And this was in the early 1900s.
Right.
So I think that influence was very much part of our home. And we grew up in it. And we lived that life.
As we reflect on Dr. Keshavjee's remarkable journey, it's poignant to recognize the parallel paths of migration that have shaped his family's and his own life stories. Dr. Keshavjee's family migrated from Gujarat in India during the time of Aga Khan III, setting the stage for their involvement in the Ismaili community's education and development in South Africa. For Dr. Keshavjee, his journey took him further across continents, from South Africa to East Africa, and eventually to the West, where his achievements flourished under the leadership of His Highness Aga Khan IV. The Aga Khan's leadership, vision, and commitment to human development guided the Ismaili community through periods of transition and conflict. And it was under his direction and guidance that Dr. Keshavjee found space for his work in mediation, conflict resolution, and community development. Now, with the transition of the Ismaili Imamat from His Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan IV to His Highness Prince Rahim Al Husseini Aga Khan V, his legacy continues to inform not only Dr. Keshavjee's own work, but the broader Ismaili community and the world at large. Dr. Keshavjee reflects on the legacy of His late Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan, the 49th Ismaili Imam.
Given this present moment, which is a moment of reflection for all of us in the Jamaat, in trying to reflect on the legacy of Maulana Shah Karim Aga Khan, we are beginning to see how he impacted certain parts of our life, our reflections, our thoughts. And I thought that I would touch on the things I was fortunate to learn, having worked under him for 30 years in three major areas of development. And I recall the first time I had formally met the Imam in an interview, where he mentioned to me that it is important that we speak about who we are and what we do after we have delivered what we said we would do. Mm-hmm. So the notion of time propitiousness in terms of articulation were important for Hazrat Imam, because he said that when you talk about something when you haven't yet performed, then you do not have credibility. Whereas if you do that and your work speaks for itself, then you don't need much to say what you're doing. But he spoke about the articulation of the Ismaili understanding of life and faith and the work that the Imamat does had to be carefully calibrated as the institutions and the programs unfolded. Then there were other learnings that I gleaned, not through what the Imam said, but the way he did things. I came to realize that here was a very large vision, but it was underpinned by small steps, rather than a small vision with large steps. So this is a very interesting dynamic to see what the Imam stood for. Then there was the principle that you felt you were learning because the Imam would stretch your mind. He would tell you what he wants to see done and allow you to find a pathway. But one thing I learned was that the Imam said, go on a certain pathway of development or creating a new paradigm, but don't be rigidly fixated. If you feel you've learned something, look at a little detour of how that could be valuable. And if you see something is not viable, don't be stuck. Be ready to change course, but within a larger framework underpinned by thought, underpinned by ethical commitment, underpinned by the bigger picture that the Imamat was committed to. So here was a situation where you had Karim Shah with a multi-generational vision, but it was not just a multi-generational vision, it was a multi-generational vision underpinned by definitive action, which was timelined. So to that extent, he was very uncompromising, that performance had to be there. And it was not a performance that was by way of a product, it was by way of a process. So one started thinking more processually, if I may use that word, in terms of processes, not in terms of outcome of products. though he would have measurable outcomes, which again was very interesting to understand. One or two things just before I speak about the learning was that what did I take away from his sense of kindness, empathy, and his rewarding of a disciplined thought process. It was in 1983, I think, I was in Bangladesh with Karim Shah, and at that time there was a meeting with the ICDDR, which was a research association in Bangladesh dealing with oral rehydration therapy. And I was in charge of part of the information work. And there was a meeting where we had to curtail the photographers coming in, because if they came in a big bevy in a small room, there would be no discussions taking place. But while I was trying to negotiate that process, a little girl and a father got through. And I had to ask them to leave the room. And the girl was very disheartened. And I said, don't worry, why do you want to be here? She said, I want an autograph from the prince. So I said, I'll get it for you. Don't worry. And I think the father was a bit skeptical, but they left. They were very helpful. They were very understanding. And I sent a little note to Hazrat Imam in the meeting to say that this little girl wanted an autograph, and she was very understanding when I asked her to leave. And Hazrat Imam had that note with him. I didn't realize that because I was on the door outside. After the meeting, which may have been about an hour, if not a little more, Imam Maulana Karim Shah came out and he looked at me and he said, where is that little girl you said who wanted to have an autograph? And I took him to the room nearby, and Karim Shah gave her an autograph, and she had a little camera in her hand, and he smiled at her and he told me, he said, can you take a photograph? So I thought it was such a moving moment that despite meeting people at the highest levels of government or NGO or organization, the Imam was always conscious of the sentiment, of the feeling of a little child, that he didn't forget it. He didn't just walk out of the meeting and tell me, oh, you sent me a note, but I was busy. No, he came out and said, I wanted that. And that takes me to the last little remembrance, if one may put it, because when you work for 30 years for somebody, it's difficult to place all the incidents one has. Yes. But sometimes in your life, something comes back and you say, oh, I remember that. And this came back to me when I heard Maulana Hazrat Imam Rahim Shah's speech where he spoke about that there will be a mausoleum for the late Karim Shah that would be a fitting tribute to his sense of architectural beauty and design. And my mind went back to Kenya. I think it was in 1981, if I'm not mistaken. We had a meeting at the famous Treetops Hotel. And during the meeting, I recall that Hazrat Imam or late Karim Shah came out to discuss a little point, and I was in the veranda with him on the patio. And, he was known for being a very ardent listener. When you said something to him or you're talking, he engaged you completely for that moment, to the extent that nobody else mattered, but he would listen very intently. And suddenly, a bird flew onto the ledge and started chirping away. And the bird had the most beautiful plumage. And so Shah Karim just placed all his attention on that bird singing and chirping away for those few moments with extreme intensity of attention. And then he looked at me and he said, what beautiful colors. It was that moment of spiritual humility and an appreciation of the beauty, that in that little bird he saw the beauty of the world and the universe, which made me wonder that his sense of the aesthetics was deep. It went beyond architecture, art, design, creativity, and also an all-encompassing framework where water, light, shade, all played an important part.
From a childhood shaped by apartheid to a life dedicated to service of the Imamat, Dr. Keshavjee's journey reflects the resilience, adaptability, and vision of the Ismaili community of South Africa. Through the guidance of His Highness Aga Khan IV, this once localized community has expanded across the world, contributing to the work of Imamat institutions in meaningful ways. Dr. Keshavjee shares how his own path, from law to mediation, from education to institutional development, highlights how the Imam has nurtured individuals to think beyond traditional frameworks. It is not just about professional success, but about applying knowledge with purpose, whether in justice, policy, or community development.
Now, as to the points you made about the present time, about how we look at the present time, how we look at the community I grew up in and which left South Africa where we lived under the apartheid system, and my own journey. Taking the first point is that we are very fortunate that we have Maulana Hazrat Imam Rahim Shah, who spent 2 decades of his life in contributing to the shaping of the institutions of the Jamaat and the institutions of the Imamat. So I see great hope. We are living in a dystopic world where there are many concerns which are not particular to the Ismaili community. They are global concerns. I mean, climate change is one of them. And I think what we do have here is the strength of hope, so that there will be a transition which we call continuity in a steady state. We are very fortunate to have our present Hazrat Imam, who is committed to the challenges that we are seeing now, which he will be, inshallah, addressing in the framework of what our 49th Imam was showing us. And obviously, Maulana Hazrat Imam will bring about a new dynamic in that whole process. Secondly, you mentioned the community I came from. Well, there are very few Ismailis left in South Africa today. Many new people have come, but it's a very, very small community. But what is the point I wish to make here is that from the ravages of apartheid through the process of the wind of change in Africa, the Imam took us through a process of evolutionary thinking. And today, members of the Jamaat that was born in South Africa are playing a major role, critical role, globally in some of the Imamat institutions. You know, I can think of at least 3 or 4 who grew up in the area where I grew up. And so today, that community has now gone into other countries, or I think about 22 countries, where they've become part of the Ismaili community, but part of the community of communities. They've started now contributing to a more robust civil society through their work in universities, their work in, social justice, media. There's a whole lot of fields. So I think that when I look back now in time, it's not with any degree of pain or rancor, but it's with thinking about the power of hope that the Imamat ignited in all of us to be able to reassert our human dignity within the framework of the ethics of the faith. And lastly, my own journey. I qualified as a lawyer. I was very fortunate to go to one of the oldest law schools in Britain, maybe in the world. This is part of the Inns of Court. It was a very lovely place to be in. It's here in London, in Chancery Lane. It's called Gray's Inn. I was very fortunate to be part of that setup at the time that I went there. I went there when the decolonization process was taking place in the world. A very critical time. I had the fortune of studying with the former president of the UN. I had the good fortune of studying with the future prime minister of a country. So I was very, very fortunate. I also studied law in Kenya, and I also studied law in Canada. And in each case, I was very fortunate that I did study academic law. But I think I was more fortunate that I was not left in the adversarial process of law, because that can be very attritive It can be very destructive in my particular view. I do not decry law. I respect law. I respect lawyers. But I think that in my own journey, by the Imam picking me out of the legal profession and placing me in three very important segments of the work that he wanted to see emerge in the years ahead. One was the field of information, where I cut my teeth on the first aspect or first part of my work in the Imamat. They were all overlapping. Mm-hmm. The second was in the restructuring of the Ismaili Tariqa and religious education boards, where I was the coordinator globally for all the boards. For me, that was an incredibly fascinating and very steep learning curve. And then, of course, the third part of my stay was in the field of alternative dispute resolution, where Imam Karim Shah was very gracious in allowing me to go and do a master's and then a doctorate. But in the process, I realized that law was not a linear, mechanical process, that law could be a great instrument for the upholding of justice. But equally, I realized that law could also be an instrument of injustice, depending how law is used in human society. But I got an understanding of the deepest significance of law, what law is capable of doing, and that law is not always the precursor to justice, but also that law can be an important structure through which those who are committed to fairness, to compassion, and to understanding can play a role. And I am very happy to say today that through the work of the Imamat, I was able to see dimensions in law which I might not have seen had I been in the adversarial process, for which I feel extremely grateful. And I feel that it has enriched my understanding of jurisprudential purpose, of the sociology of law, and the anthropology of justice.
Looking back, this is a story not of loss, but of transformation. Of a community that, despite displacement, found strength in continuity and hope. Today, Ismailis from South Africa play critical roles in shaping civil society, academia, and global initiatives, carrying forward the ethics of their faith. Through life story oral histories, we capture not just memories, but the spirit of service, dignity, and the enduring legacy of the Ismaili Imamat's vision. The Oral History Project of the Ismaili Special Collections Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies seeks to preserve the memories, experiences, and stories of members of the Ismaili communities across the world in their own voices. Do you have a story to share with the IIS Oral History Project? If you want to share your memories, the story of your family, or the story of an elder you know, please reach out to the Oral History Project Coordinator, Rizwan Karim, at rkarim@iis.ac.uk.